The sterile silence of the marble foyer was the only thing greeting billionaire Richard Sterling on the most important day of his life. Not his 8 months pregnant wife, Olivia, but an unnerving, empty quiet. She was gone, vanished just hours before a court hearing that would decide the fate of his empire. As his mistress, Isabella, flashes a triumphant smirk from across the courtroom, Richard's annoyance curdles into a cold dread. He thought he controlled everything, but her disappearance was a move he never anticipated. Then, a single letter arrives, and the truth it holds will shatter his world forever. The early morning light, thin and gray as watered-down milk, filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, illuminating the cold, sterile perfection of Richard Sterling's world. Every surface, from the Italian marble floors to the chrome legs of the minimalist furniture, gleamed with an impersonal polish. It was a home designed not for comfort, but for display, a testament to a life curated for the pages of financial magazines. In the center of this opulent cage sat Olivia, 8.5 months pregnant, her body a soft, round anomaly in a landscape of sharp angles. She stared out at the sprawling, indifferent skyline of downtown Chicago, her hands resting protectively on the taut swell of her belly, where their son, their unborn child, kicked with a restless energy that mirrored her own internal turmoil. Today was the day the court would hear the final arguments in the ugly, protracted legal battle that would formally dissolve not just their marriage, but the business partnership that had once been the foundation of their life together. Richard wanted everything, not just the lion's share of Sterling Enterprises, the real estate empire he had built, but the parts she had nurtured into existence, the boutique hotel chains, the charitable foundation. He wanted to erase her, to reduce her role in his monumental success to a mere footnote. And he was, by all accounts, winning. The scent of expensive, bitter coffee preceded him. Richard emerged from their bedroom suite, already dressed in a bespoke navy suit that cost more than most people's cars. His dark hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set, his blue eyes holding the same chilly glint as the glass and steel towers outside. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the tablet in his hand, already scrolling through market reports. "The car will be here at 8, Olivia. Don't be late," he said, his voice clipped, devoid of warmth. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Olivia turned from the window, her gaze falling on her husband. The man she had once loved with a desperate, all-consuming passion now felt like a stranger. A handsome, polished predator who saw her not as his wife, the mother of his child, but as an obstacle. Her love had been a liability, a weakness he had exploited time and again. "I'll be ready," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. The fight had leached out of her over the past few months, replaced by a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion. Her lawyer, a kind but overwhelmed public defender Richard's legal team had run circles around, had warned her to prepare for the worst. Prepare to walk away with nothing but the baby she carried. "See that you are," Richard said, still not looking up. He moved to the espresso machine, the hiss and gurgle of the appliance filling the cavernous silence between them. "And for God's sake, try to look presentable, not like some tragic, weeping victim. The board members will be watching." The cruelty of it, the casual way he dismissed her pain, sent a familiar tremor through her. It wasn't just about the money or the business anymore. It was about power. He needed to see her broken, to prove to himself and the world that he was the sole architect of his success, that she was nothing. She had poured 10 years of her life into their dream, working alongside him, her vision and acumen shaping key acquisitions. But Richard had rewritten their history, painting her as a decorative socialite wife who was now trying to steal what she hadn't earned. She pushed herself up from the sofa, the effort making her groan softly. Her reflection in the dark glass of the window startled her. Her face was pale and puffy, dark circles like bruises under her eyes. Richard was right. She looked like a victim, defeated. "I'm going to get changed," she murmured, walking past him toward their bedroom. She could feel his eyes on her back, a cold, dismissive appraisal. He didn't see the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing, the woman who had calmed his fears and celebrated his triumphs. He saw only an adversary in a high-stakes game. Inside the cavernous walk-in closet, surrounded by rows of designer clothes that felt like a costume from another life, Olivia's resolve began to crumble. Her hands shook as she reached for the simple navy maternity dress her lawyer had advised her to wear. Modest, sympathetic. The walls, lined with silk and cashmere, felt like they were closing in. The air was thick with the scent of Richard's cologne, a fragrance she now associated with lies and betrayal. She sank onto a velvet ottoman, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The baby kicked again, a sharp, insistent jab just under her ribs. "I can't do this," she thought, a raw, silent scream echoing in her mind. "I can't sit in that courtroom and watch him strip everything away from us. I can't let our son be born into this poison." Her eyes darted around the closet, landing on a small, leather-bound book tucked away on a shelf. Her old journal. On impulse, she reached for it, her fingers tracing the worn cover. Inside were the faded, hopeful words of a young woman in love, chronicling the birth of their company, the dreams they had shared. It was a story of we and us, a story Richard had systematically erased. A new feeling began to surface, pushing through the fog of despair, a spark of defiance, cold and hard as a diamond. He had left her with nothing. No, that wasn't true. He had left her with nothing to lose. And in that moment, a decision crystallized. It was a terrifying, audacious, and utterly desperate plan. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about surviving. It was about protecting the one precious thing he couldn't touch. Their child. She stood up, her movements suddenly filled with a purpose that had been absent for months. She pulled a small, nondescript suitcase from the top shelf, her heart hammering against her ribs. She packed only the essentials: the journal, a small bundle of cash she'd been stashing away, a few changes of clothes, and a set of prenatal vitamins. She looked at her reflection one last time, not in the polished mirrors of the closet, but in the dark screen of her phone. She saw the fear. Yes, but underneath it there was a flicker of something else. A flicker of the woman she used to be. At precisely 7:45 a.m., Richard glanced at his watch. "Olivia!" he called out, his voice laced with impatience. 15 minutes! Silence. With an exasperated sigh, he strode toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was made. The closet door was open, the navy dress she was meant to wear still hanging on its hook. On the pristine white duvet of their bed lay her phone, her wallet, and the diamond engagement ring he'd given her a decade ago. It caught the morning light, casting a brilliant, mocking little rainbow on the ceiling. There was no note, no explanation, just a void where his wife was supposed to be. Olivia Sterling, 8.5 months pregnant, had vanished. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B was as stuffy and tense as a sealed tomb. The air, thick with the scent of old paper and simmering resentment, was a stark contrast to the breezy, sterile luxury of Richard's penthouse. He sat at the polished defendant's table, a perfect model of controlled irritation. His lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Marcus Thorne, leaned in occasionally to murmur legal platitudes, but Richard's focus was on the large oak doors at the back of the room. It was 9:15 a.m. The hearing was supposed to start at 9. Olivia was late. He wasn't worried, not in the way a husband should be. He was annoyed. This was a tactic. He was sure of it. A desperate last-ditch attempt by Olivia to garner sympathy, to paint him as the callous husband who had driven his heavily pregnant wife to a state of emotional distress. It was pathetic. It was also, he had to admit, inconvenient. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Eleanor Vance, did not appreciate tardiness. He felt a subtle shift in the room's energy, a ripple of whispers. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her, Isabella Rossi. She slipped into the back row of the gallery, a vision in a crimson dress that clung to her sculpted figure. Her long, dark hair fell in a perfect cascade over her shoulders, and her lips, painted the same shade as her dress, were curved into a subtle, knowing smile. She was everything Olivia wasn't: bold, audacious, and utterly unapologetic. She met Richard's gaze across the crowded room, and one of her perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched just slightly. It was a look of shared victory, a silent acknowledgement of their impending triumph. Richard turned away, a flicker of unease disturbing his composure. He had told Isabella not to come. Her presence was a blatant provocation, a move that could easily backfire with a judge like Vance. But Isabella rarely did as she was told. She thrived on drama, on the power she wielded over him, a power rooted in a passion and ruthlessness that mirrored his own. At 9:30 a.m., Judge Vance finally swept into the room, her black robes rustling like dry leaves. She settled into her high-backed chair and peered down at the courtroom over her spectacles, her expression already sour. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Where is your client's wife?" Marcus Thorne stood, his posture a study in practiced deference. "Your Honor, we were expecting Mrs. Sterling to arrive separately. We've been unable to reach her this morning. We are, of course, concerned." The lie was smooth, effortless. Concern was the last thing Richard felt. Olivia's lawyer, a young, earnest man named Ben Carter, shot to his feet, his face pale with genuine worry. "Your Honor, I've been trying to contact my client since 8 o'clock this morning. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. This is highly out of character for her. Mrs. Sterling understood the gravity of today's hearing." Judge Vance's gaze hardened. She looked from Carter's frantic expression to Richard's mask of detached composure. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping, "when was the last time you saw your wife?" Richard stood slowly, projecting an air of reluctant duty. "This morning, Your Honor. Around 7:30. She was getting ready for the hearing." "And you have no idea where she might be?" "None at all," Richard said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He knew exactly what this was. She was hiding somewhere, probably at a friend's house, waiting for the most dramatic moment to make her reappearance. For the next hour, the court descended into a procedural quagmire. Ben Carter requested a wellness check at the penthouse. Marcus Thorne objected, calling it a waste of the court's time and a clear stalling tactic. The judge, her patience worn thin, ordered a recess and dispatched 2 bailiffs to the Sterling residence. During the break, the whispers in the gallery grew louder. Richard could feel the eyes on him, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He ignored them, keeping his gaze fixed on the wall ahead. But he was acutely aware of Isabella. She hadn't moved from her seat, a serene smile still playing on her lips. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I knew this would happen. I won." Her confidence was unnerving. While he saw Olivia's absence as a cheap theatrical trick, Isabella seemed to view it as a final definitive surrender, as if she knew something he didn't. He watched as his lawyer, Marcus, approached her. They spoke in hushed tones, their heads close together. Marcus's expression was grim, but Isabella simply shrugged, her crimson-clad shoulders rising and falling in a gesture of effortless nonchalance. She then looked directly at Richard, her smile widening ever so slightly. It was no longer a smile of victory. It was a smirk, a smug, triumphant smirk that sent a chill down his spine. It was the look of a co-conspirator, of someone who had been let in on a secret he had yet to unravel. What had Olivia done? The bailiffs returned just before 11, their faces grim. They spoke quietly with the judge, who listened intently, her expression growing more severe with each passing second. Finally, she banged her gavel, the sharp crack silencing the room. Mr. Carter, Mr. Thorne approached the bench. Richard watched as the two lawyers walked forward. He saw the judge pass a piece of paper to Ben Carter, who read it and visibly sagged, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Marcus read it next, his face remaining impassive, but Richard saw the slight tightening around his eyes. When Marcus returned to the table, he leaned in close. "The police have been notified," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "They found her phone and wallet in the apartment. No signs of forced entry. She's officially been listed as a missing person." The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Missing person. It wasn't a tactic. It wasn't a game. This was something else entirely. Richard's mind raced, trying to process the implications. An investigation. Police. Media. His carefully controlled world was about to be ripped open. He chanced to look back at Isabella. The smirk was gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Her eyes glittered with a predatory light. She had wanted Olivia gone, and now, by some bizarre twist of fate, she was. In that moment, Richard didn't see a lover. He saw an opportunist, a woman who would dance on the ashes of his life without a second thought. And for the first time that day, a genuine cold knot of fear began to form in the pit of his stomach. Olivia was gone. And the only person in the world who seemed happy about it was the woman sitting in the back row, smiling like a cat who had just swallowed a canary. The courtroom was a chaotic hive of activity. Reporters who had been sniffing around the high-profile divorce for weeks descended like vultures, their cameras flashing, their questions a barrage of sharp, intrusive barbs. Richard, shielded by Marcus Thorne and a pair of imposing security guards, moved through the storm with a practiced, icy detachment. He offered a single, terse statement, crafted by Marcus in the 30 seconds it took to walk from the bench to the exit. "My only concern right now is for the safety of my wife and my unborn child," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone that conveyed the perfect measure of grave concern. "I urge anyone with information to contact the Chicago PD immediately. We are cooperating fully with their investigation." It was a masterful performance. He looked like the aggrieved husband, his world suddenly and inexplicably shattered. But inside, a different storm was raging. This wasn't part of his plan. Olivia's disappearance had turned his meticulously orchestrated legal victory into a public relations nightmare. He was no longer the brilliant, beleaguered tycoon. He was a potential suspect. Back in the sleek, sterile conference room of Marcus Thorne's law firm, the mask began to slip. The firm occupied the top 3 floors of a skyscraper overlooking Millennium Park, a temple of corporate power where morality was a fluid concept. "A missing pregnant woman is a media goldmine, Richard," Marcus said, pacing in front of a panoramic window. "And you, the cold, powerful husband she was in a bitter divorce with, are the prime suspect. We need to get ahead of this now." Richard loosened his tie, the knot suddenly feeling like a noose. "It's a stunt, Marcus. She's hiding somewhere, trying to make me look bad. And it's working," Marcus countered, stopping to fix Richard with a hard stare. "Right now it doesn't matter what the truth is. It matters what people believe. And they will want to believe the worst. We need to control the narrative." The strategy session that followed was a cold, calculated exercise in damage control. They would offer a reward, a substantial one, $100,000. "No," Marcus argued, "make it $250,000. It had to be a figure that screamed desperation, not just obligation. They would hire a private investigator, a former FBI agent with a sterling reputation, to run a parallel investigation. It was all about perception. They had to look like they were moving heaven and earth to find her, even if Richard privately believed she was perfectly safe, sipping chamomile tea in some suburban hideaway. His phone buzzed. It was Isabella. He ignored it. He had sent her home in a separate car, warning her not to speak to anyone. Her smug satisfaction in the courtroom had curdled into something dangerous. She was a liability, a loose cannon in a situation that required absolute precision. When he finally returned to the penthouse late that afternoon, the place felt different. The unnerving quiet from the morning had been replaced by the subtle, yet invasive, presence of law enforcement. Two detectives, a man and a woman who looked tired and unimpressed by the opulence surrounding them, were waiting for him. Detective Miller, the man, was stocky and rumpled, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His partner, Detective Chen, was sharp and observant, her questions precise and pointed. They walked him through the apartment, asking him to recount the morning's events again. "So, you argued last night, Mr. Sterling?" Miller asked, his tone deceptively casual as they stood in the silent, cavernous bedroom. "We had a disagreement," Richard corrected him, his voice tight. "Divorces are contentious." "About what?" Chen pressed, picking up a silver-framed photo from the bedside table. It was from their wedding day. Two smiling, hopeful people who no longer existed. "The settlement," Richard lied. The fight had been far more personal, a final, ugly rehashing of his affair with Isabella, of every broken promise and casual cruelty. He'd told Olivia she was being overly dramatic, that she'd leave the marriage with more money than she could ever spend. He'd told her she should be grateful. "And you left for your morning run at 6, as usual?" Miller continued. "Yes, I was gone for about an hour." An hour. A 60-minute window. He could already see the timeline they were building, the suspicion tightening around him. He felt a surge of rage. Not at Olivia, but at the inconvenience of it all, at the sheer audacity of her actions. She had made him vulnerable. She had taken away his control. After the detectives left, leaving a lingering scent of cheap coffee and suspicion, Richard found himself alone in the vast, silent apartment. It was the first time he'd been truly alone in hours, and the weight of the day crashed down on him. The walls, which had always felt like a fortress, now felt like a prison. Every gleaming surface seemed to mock him, reflecting a distorted image of a man who had everything and nothing. He walked into Olivia's dressing room. Her scent, a faint floral perfume he'd bought her in Paris, still hung in the air. It was a ghost of a scent, a reminder of a time when their life had been filled with a different kind of silence, a comfortable one. He opened a drawer and saw her things, neatly arranged. Lotions, hair clips, a half-finished book. Mundane objects that felt sacred and profane in their sudden abandonment. He had believed he knew her completely. He had catalogued her weaknesses, her fears, her dependencies. He had used them against her, wielding his knowledge like a weapon to keep her in line. He had assumed she was predictable, that her actions would always be dictated by the timid, gentle nature he had come to despise. But this was something else. This was an act of a stranger. His phone buzzed again. Isabella. He answered it this time, his voice a low growl. "What?" "Richie, baby, don't be like that," she purred, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I'm just worried about you. This must be so stressful." "What did you say to Marcus in the courtroom?" he demanded, cutting through her pretense. There was a slight pause. "We were just discussing how fortunate this timing is. Once she's declared unfit, you'll get everything. Custody of the baby, the whole company. It's what you wanted, isn't it?" The cold-blooded pragmatism of her words, The way she saw a human being's disappearance as a strategic advantage sent a wave of revulsion through him. He had been drawn to that ruthlessness in her, that reflection of his own ambition. But now it seemed grotesque. "Stay away from this, Isabella," he warned. "Don't talk to the press. Don't talk to anyone. Do you understand me?" "Of course, darling," she said, her voice turning sultry. "Whatever you need. I'm here for you. We're in this together, remember?" He hung up without saying goodbye. The word "together" echoed in the silent room. He had never been together with anyone, not really. He had partners, assets, acquisitions. Olivia had been the closest he'd ever come, and he had methodically dismantled that connection, piece by piece, until nothing was left. Now, standing in the wreckage of his life, surrounded by the ghosts of a happiness he had destroyed, Richard Sterling felt a terrifying, unfamiliar emotion. He felt utterly, completely alone. And for the first time, he started to wonder if Olivia was just hiding. He started to wonder if he would ever see her again. 3 days passed in a blur of strategic meetings, police interviews, and blinding camera flashes. Richard's life had become a meticulously managed stage play. He was the grieving, desperate husband, a role he performed with chilling precision. He held a press conference on the steps of his corporate headquarters, his face a mask of weary anguish as he announced the $250,000 reward for any information leading to Olivia's safe return. The media lapped it up, splashing his tormented face across every news channel and website. "Find Olivia Sterling" trended on social media, a digital chorus of sympathy and speculation. Behind the scenes, it was a war room. Marcus Thorne and a team of PR experts managed the media narrative, feeding carefully selected positive stories about Richard's philanthropy and his devotion to his wife. The private investigator, a stoic ex-FBI agent named David Chen, began his own discreet inquiries, digging into Olivia's life with an unnerving thoroughness. He interviewed her few friends, her estranged family, her yoga instructor. A picture began to emerge of a lonely, isolated woman, increasingly cut off from her support system. It was a picture that did not reflect well on Richard. Richard himself was running on caffeine and barely concealed rage. Every passing hour that Olivia remained missing chipped away at his control, his sanity. The police treated him with a cloying, professional suspicion that made his skin crawl. They had searched his car, requested his phone records, and asked pointed questions about the life insurance policy he held on Olivia, a standard part of their corporate partnership agreement, but one that sounded sinister in the sterile environment of an interrogation room. His only respite was work, the familiar, comforting world of numbers and deals. He buried himself in spreadsheets and acquisition proposals, the clean, cold logic of business a balm to his frayed nerves. He needed to feel powerful again, to reassert his dominance over a world that was rapidly spinning out of his grasp. On the 4th day, the letter arrived. It didn't come to the penthouse, which was now perpetually staked out by news vans. It was delivered by a courier to his private office at Sterling Enterprises, bypassing the mailroom, bypassing his assistant. It was a simple, plain manila envelope, addressed to him in neat, elegant handwriting he recognized instantly. Olivia's handwriting. His heart gave a hard, painful jolt. He dismissed his assistant for the day and locked his office door. With trembling hands, he tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, the kind she used for personal correspondence. The letter was not long. "Richard, if you are reading this, it means my plan has worked. You can call off your search. You can dismiss the private investigators and stop performing for the cameras. I am not missing. I am free. I know you believe this is some sort of tactic, a move in our ugly game to gain leverage in the divorce. But you stripped me of all leverage long ago. You also stripped me of my dignity, my self-worth, and the belief that you ever truly loved me. You left me with nothing, and for that I am now strangely grateful. Because in that nothingness, I finally found the one thing I couldn't afford to lose, the will to protect our son. I am not a fool, Richard. I know you. I know you would have used him, just as you used me. He would have become a pawn in your world, another asset to be managed and controlled. You would have taught him that love is transactional, that vulnerability is weakness, and that power is the only thing that matters. I will not let that happen. I will not raise our son in the shadow of your cold ambition. I watched you rewrite our history, erasing me from the story of our success, and I know you would have done the same to my role as a mother. You would have bought him the best of everything and given him the worst of yourself. You would have owned him. So I have disappeared. I have taken the one thing you can't put a price on. I have taken our child far away from your influence, from your money, and from the poison that has corrupted your soul. Don't try to find us. You have an army of lawyers and investigators, and I have only a small head start and a desperate mother's will to survive. But I promise you, you will not find us. Every dollar you spend searching will be a dollar wasted. This is not a negotiation. It is a declaration. I am not your victim anymore. You will not see your son. You will not control his life. He will grow up knowing that he is loved, not for what he can become, but for who he is. He will grow up knowing kindness and empathy, qualities you have long since forgotten. You have your empire, Richard. That is what you truly love. May it keep you warm at night. Olivia. Richard read the letter once, then twice, then a third time. The words swam before his eyes. It wasn't a ransom note. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a verdict, a judgment delivered with the cool, cutting precision of a surgeon's scalpel. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him. Disbelief, fury, and something else, something he couldn't name. It felt like the ground had fallen away beneath him. She hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't had a breakdown. She had left him. Deliberately, methodically, she had outmaneuvered him. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles turning white. The sheer, calculated audacity of it stole his breath. She had planned this. While he was strategizing with his lawyers, she was plotting her escape. While he saw her as a broken, weeping victim, she was quietly severing every tie, preparing to vanish into thin air. He stumbled back from his desk, a strangled sound escaping his throat. It was a laugh, but it was hollow, jagged. She thought she could hide from him? Him? Richard Sterling? He had built an empire from nothing. He had crushed competitors, bent politicians to his will. The world was his chessboard. And she, his quiet, unassuming wife, thought she could simply walk off the board? The fury was a wildfire now, burning away the shock. He would find her. He would tear this country apart, state by state, city by city, until he found her. He would use every resource, every contact, every drop of his considerable wealth and power. This was no longer about a divorce settlement. This was about possession. She had taken something that belonged to him. His wife, his son, his heir. He smoothed the crumpled letter out on his desk, his hands shaking with rage. He stared at her name, at the final, damning sign-off. Olivia. The name of the woman he thought he knew, the woman he thought he owned. He had made one critical, catastrophic mistake. He had underestimated her. And in the silent, opulent tomb of his office, surrounded by the trappings of his immense power, Richard Sterling understood for the first time that he was in a war he had no idea how to win. The letter acted as a powerful, corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of Richard's carefully constructed world. His initial volcanic rage slowly gave way to a gnawing, obsessive paranoia. Olivia was no longer just a missing person. She was a ghost, a phantom who had outplayed him and now haunted his every waking moment. The city, once his kingdom, now felt like a labyrinth of potential hiding places. Every pregnant woman he saw on the street made his heart seize. Every news report about his tragic loss felt like a personal mockery. He doubled down. The $250,000 reward was increased to $1 million. He hired 2 more private investigation firms, rival agencies, hoping their competition would breed results. He put his own corporate security team on the case, a group of ruthless ex-Mossad agents who typically handled industrial espionage. The search became his singular obsession, a black hole that consumed his time, his energy, and his money. Sterling Enterprises, his prized empire, ran on autopilot as its CEO waged a silent, frantic war against an enemy of one. His meetings were no longer about acquisitions. They were about intelligence reports. Maps were spread across his boardroom table, not of real estate developments, but of bus routes, train schedules, and small, forgotten towns within a 500-mile radius of Chicago. She would need money, he'd snarl at David Chen, the lead PI. She didn't take her credit cards, check every pawn shop, every check-cashing establishment. She had jewelry, a Rolex watch I gave her for our anniversary. "We've checked, Mr. Sterling," Chen would reply, his voice maddeningly calm. "Nothing has surfaced. Your wife is either extremely careful or she had help." The idea of an accomplice sent Richard into fresh paroxysms of fury. Who would help her? Her timid friends? Her estranged parents in Florida? He had investigators harass every single person she had ever known, burning bridges and sowing fear, but the trail remained ice cold. It was as if Olivia had stepped out of the penthouse and simply dissolved into thin air. His paranoia began to bleed into his relationship with Isabella. The passion that had once defined them had curdled into suspicion. He looked at her now and saw not a lover, but a potential co-conspirator. Her initial triumph had faded, replaced by a growing unease as she watched Richard spiral. One evening, she found him in his home office, staring at a wall covered in maps and photographs of Olivia. He looked haggard, his suit jacket discarded, his eyes bloodshot. "Richie," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You need to stop this. You're destroying yourself." He flinched at her touch, shrugging her hand away. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowed into icy slits. "You were so happy when she was gone," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "So confident. Why? Did you know something, Isabella? Did she talk to you?" Isabella recoiled, her face a mixture of shock and offense. "What? Of course not. Why would I talk to her?" "Because you're both women," he sneered, the words laced with a venom that surprised even him. "Maybe you had some secret alliance, the scorned wife and the ambitious mistress teaming up to take down the evil tycoon. It's a good story." "That's insane!" she shot back, her voice rising. "I wanted her out of your life, yes. I wanted you to myself. But this is a circus. I'm being followed by reporters. My photo is in the tabloids next to hers. This isn't what I wanted." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his size and fury a palpable threat. "Then what did you want, Isabella? Tell me, what was your endgame?" "I wanted to be Mrs. Sterling," she finally screamed, the words raw and desperate. "I wanted this life, the penthouse, the parties, the respect. I didn't want you to become this broken, obsessed man hunting a ghost." Her confession, her raw ambition laid bare, did nothing to soothe him. It only fueled his suspicion. He saw her now as a parasite, another person who wanted something from him. He had believed their connection was different, a meeting of two powerful, like-minded souls. But in the harsh light of his unraveling, he saw it for what it was, a transaction. Just like his marriage, just like everything else in his life. "Get out," he whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. "Richard." "Get out," he roared, sweeping a stack of files from his desk. Papers scattered across the marble floor like fallen leaves. Isabella stared at him, her eyes wide with a fear he had never seen in her before. For the first time, she saw the man behind the power, the wealth, the control. She saw a man teetering on the edge of an abyss, and she realized with a sickening lurch that he was capable of pulling her down with him. Without another word, she turned and fled. Alone again in the silent apartment, Richard sank into his chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him hollow and trembling. The confident, untouchable billionaire was gone. In his place was a desperate man, haunted by the woman he had driven away. He looked at the photos of Olivia on the wall. Her smile seemed to mock him, her eyes holding a secret he couldn't unlock. He had spent years seeing her as a beautiful but fragile accessory to his life. He had never bothered to look deeper, to understand the steel that lay beneath her gentle exterior. He had never truly seen her at all. The letter had said, "May your empire keep you warm at night." But the penthouse had never felt colder. His wealth, his power, it was all useless. It couldn't buy him the one thing he now craved more than any deal or acquisition: an answer. He wasn't just hunting for his wife and his heir anymore. He was hunting for a piece of himself, the piece that had been so certain, so in control, the piece that Olivia had stolen when she walked out the door. His unraveling was no longer a slow spiral. It was a free fall. The door to the penthouse slammed shut, the sound echoing Isabella's own shattered ambitions. The life she had so carefully constructed, the future she had envisioned as the next Mrs. Sterling, had evaporated in a storm of Richard's making. She had hitched her wagon to a titan, never imagining that his foundations were so brittle, that the disappearance of one quiet woman could cause him to crumble into such a paranoid, volatile mess. Isabella Rossi was a survivor. She had grown up in the gritty, working-class suburbs of Cicero, a world away from Richard's rarefied air. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a waitress, and they had instilled in her a single, unwavering belief: that the world was a brutal, unfair place, and you had to be willing to do whatever it took to claw your way to the top. She had used her stunning looks and sharp intellect as a key, unlocking doors that would have otherwise remained firmly shut. She'd worked her way through college, then into the competitive world of high-end art dealing, where she first met Richard Sterling. She saw him not as a man to love, but as an opportunity to seize. He was her ticket out, her endgame. She didn't delude herself into thinking he loved her. She knew their connection was based on a shared, ruthless ambition and a fiery physical passion. She had accepted that bargain. She had been content to be the other woman, the exciting, dangerous alternative to his placid, elegant wife. She had believed with absolute certainty that it was only a matter of time before he grew tired of Olivia's quiet grace and chose her instead. Olivia's disappearance should have been her ultimate victory. The final obstacle had simply removed herself from the board. But Isabella had miscalculated. She had failed to understand the complex, twisted nature of Richard's bond with his wife. He didn't love Olivia, not in any conventional sense, but Olivia belonged to him. Her existence, her subservience, was a necessary part of his identity. Her vanishing was not a liberation for him. It was a profound, personal theft that had unhinged him. Now, Isabella was adrift. Richard had cast her out. The media, once fascinated by her as the glamorous mistress, was beginning to turn on her, painting her as a scheming homewrecker. Her art gallery clients were becoming distant. The respectable world she had fought so hard to enter was closing its doors to her. She was becoming a pariah. Days turned into a week. Her frantic calls to Richard went unanswered. She was cut off, isolated. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, began to set in. She had tied her entire future to Richard, and that future was now a smoldering ruin. One rainy afternoon, sitting in her chic, lonely apartment, an idea began to form. It was a gamble, a desperate, high-stakes move that could either save her or destroy her completely. If Richard couldn't find Olivia, maybe she could. It started as a theory, a whisper of intuition. She thought back to her conversations with Richard, to the bitter, offhand comments he'd made about his wife over the years. He'd always painted Olivia as weak and sentimental. He'd once mockingly mentioned a place she used to talk about, a place she'd visited with her grandmother as a child, some ridiculous backwater town on the coast of Maine, a place she called her happy place. It was the kind of soft, emotional detail Richard would dismiss as trivial, but to Isabella, it felt like a clue. Olivia wouldn't run to her family or friends. Richard's investigators would be all over them. She would run to a memory. She would run to a place where she felt safe. Isabella began to dig. She used her skills as a dealer, her ability to trace the provenance of a piece of art, and applied them to a human life. She bypassed the brutish, expensive methods of Richard's PIs and used subtlety and instinct. She found an old article in a society magazine about a charity fundraiser Olivia had chaired, which mentioned her passion for supporting rural libraries. The article named her grandmother. From there, she found an obituary, which named a small town in Maine, Harbor Cove. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on nothing more than a woman's intuition about another woman. But it was all she had. She booked a flight to Portland, Maine, under an assumed name, paying in cash. She rented a car and drove north, the sleek skyscrapers of Chicago giving way to dense pine forests and a rugged, rocky coastline. Harbor Cove was exactly the kind of place Richard would detest. It was small, quaint, and utterly unimpressed with the outside world. The salt-laced air smelled of low tide and wood smoke. Isabella checked into a small, nondescript motel on the edge of town. She shed her designer clothes and her city persona, trading them for jeans, a sweater, and a baseball cap. She spent the next 2 days just watching, listening. She sat in the town's only coffee shop, walked through the aisles of the small grocery store, and browsed the shelves of the local library, the very library Olivia's grandmother had helped fund. On the 3rd day, she saw her, a very pregnant woman with familiar, gentle features and blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, walking out of a small bookstore on Main Street. She was wearing overalls and a faded cardigan, and she looked happy. There was a serenity in her face, a calm strength that Isabella had never seen in the haunted, elegant woman from Chicago. It was Olivia. Isabella's heart hammered in her chest. For a moment she was frozen, unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to call Richard, to claim her victory and her reward. But she hesitated. What would Richard do? He would descend on this quiet little town with his lawyers and his anger, drag Olivia back to a life she clearly didn't want, and use their child as a weapon. And what would Isabella get in return? A place back at the side of a broken, vengeful man? A different path opened up in her mind. A new gamble. She watched Olivia get into an old, beat-up Subaru and drive away. Isabella followed her, keeping a safe distance, her mind racing. She followed her to a small, secluded cottage overlooking the ocean, tucked away at the end of a dirt road. She didn't approach the house. Instead, she sat in her car, watching the lights turn on as dusk fell. She had found Olivia Sterling. She held all the cards. But for the first time in her life, Isabella wasn't sure how she wanted to play her hand. Calling Richard was the logical move, the one that aligned with her original plan. But seeing Olivia, so peaceful and so free, had stirred something unexpected within her. Perhaps the prize wasn't Richard after all. Perhaps the prize was power, the power to decide the fates of both the king and the queen in this twisted fairy tale, and that was a gamble worth considering. The salt-scrubbed air of Harbor Cove, Maine, was a world away from the recycled, climate-controlled atmosphere of her Chicago penthouse. Here, the air was alive. It tasted of the sea, of pine needles, of wood smoke from a distant chimney. For Olivia, it was the taste of freedom. Her new home was a small, weathered cottage perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic. It had been her grandmother's, left to her in a trust Richard had never bothered to investigate, deeming its value insignificant. The cottage was the opposite of their penthouse. It was cozy, imperfect, and filled with the ghosts of happy memories. The floorboards creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and every chipped teacup and faded quilt told a story. In the first few weeks, Olivia had moved in a fog of adrenaline and fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every car that drove down her long gravel driveway sent a spike of panic through her. She expected to see Richard's face at her window, to hear his furious voice demanding she return to the life she had fled. She had no television and avoided the internet, creating a cocoon of willful ignorance. She did not want to see the media circus she knew her disappearance had ignited. Her plan had been meticulously crafted in the lonely, sleepless nights leading up to the court date. She had used the small amounts of cash she'd been siphoning from their household account for months. She'd bought a prepaid burner phone and a used car from a private seller, paying in cash. She had driven for 2 straight days, her belly pressed against the steering wheel, stopping only for gas and to sleep for a few fitful hours in anonymous motels. She had created a new identity, not legally, but practically. In Harbor Cove, she was not Olivia Sterling, the embattled wife of a billionaire. She was Amelia, a quiet, pregnant widow, looking for a peaceful place to have her baby. The town, with its reserved New England sensibility, accepted her story without question. They gave her space, but also kindness. The elderly woman who ran the town library, Martha, had known Olivia's grandmother. She would bring Olivia pots of homemade chowder and stacks of books on childbirth and parenting. A local doctor, a kind, semi-retired man named Dr. Evans, took her on as a patient, his gentle, unhurried manner a stark contrast to the slick, expensive specialists in Chicago. Slowly, the fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning sense of self. She spent her days walking along the cliff path, the rhythmic crash of the waves a soothing counterpoint to the anxious thrumming of her own heart. She read books, cooked simple meals, and sat for hours in a rocking chair on her porch, watching the lobster boats chug across the bay. She was rediscovering the woman she had been before Richard Sterling, a woman who loved the smell of old books, the taste of salt water, and the simple, profound beauty of a sunset over the ocean. She spoke to her baby constantly, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach. "We're safe here, little one," she would whisper into the salty wind. "No one can hurt us here. You're going to have a different life, a better life." Her new life was a court of a different kind. There were no lawyers, no judges, only the quiet, daily judgments of her own conscience. Had she done the right thing? Had she been selfish, robbing her son of a father, of a life of immense privilege? Some days, doubt would creep in, a cold, insidious fog. She would remember the early days with Richard, the brilliant, charming man she had fallen in love with, and a pang of grief would hit her with the force of a physical blow. But then she would remember the coldness in his eyes, the casual cruelty of his words, the way he had tried to possess her very soul. And she would look out at the vast, endless expanse of the ocean and know that she had made the only choice she could. She had chosen her son's well-being over Richard's wealth. She had chosen peace over power. One afternoon, while browsing in the town's small bookstore, she felt a sudden, sharp contraction. It took her breath away. A second one followed, stronger this time. The baby was coming. Panic, cold and sharp, flared briefly, but she pushed it down. She had prepared for this. She drove herself to the small local clinic where Dr. Evans practiced. Martha, the librarian, met her there, having been designated as her emergency contact. The labor was long and difficult, but Olivia was not alone. Martha was by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, her calm, steady presence a lifeline in a sea of pain. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the small, simple room, Olivia gave one final push, and her son was born. Dr. Evans placed the crying, squirming baby on her chest. He was perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, like Richard's, but when he opened his eyes, they were her own, a soft, gentle brown. Tears streamed down Olivia's face, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming, unconditional love. "Hello, Noah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had chosen the name months ago. It meant rest and comfort. Holding her son, feeling his tiny, warm body against hers, Olivia knew with an unshakable certainty that she had made the right choice. This was real. This love, this tiny, perfect human being. This was her empire. And it was one that Richard Sterling, with all his money and all his power, could never touch. She had not just escaped a prison. She had created a sanctuary. And in this quiet, peaceful court, she had finally, truly, won. The call came from a burner phone, an untraceable number that lit up Richard's private line like a lit fuse. He was in his office, staring at the same maps, the same dead ends. He answered, his voice a raw bark. "Who is this? Is $1 million still a lot of money to you, Richard?" The voice was female, smooth as silk, and unnervingly familiar. It took him a second to place it. Isabella. "Where the hell are you?" he snarled. "Let's just say I succeeded where your army of expensive men failed," she purred. "I know where she is. I know where your son is." The world tilted on its axis. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. "Where? Not so fast," she laughed, a low, triumphant sound. "Finding her wasn't for you. It was for me. I'm cashing out, Richard. Transfer $5 million to an offshore account, and I'll give you an address. Consider it a severance package. You try to trace this call, you try to find me, and you'll never see either of them again. You have 1 hour." She hung up. The dial tone buzzed in his ear, a sound of absolute finality. $5 million. It was a staggering sum, but to him it was dust, a rounding error. He didn't hesitate. He made the transfer. He knew Isabella well enough to know she wasn't bluffing. This was her gamble, her final play. 45 minutes later, a text message arrived with a single address in a town he'd never heard of. Harbor Cove, Maine. The flight on his private jet was agonizing. The roar of the engines was a dull echo of the storm inside him. What would he do when he found her? Drag her back? Threaten her? The old Richard, the man from a few weeks ago, would have had a plan, a strategy for subjugation. But that man was gone, eroded by sleepless nights and the gnawing acid of his own powerlessness. He didn't know what he wanted anymore, other than to see her, to see the son he had never met. He rented a car at the small airport in Portland and drove north, the address a burning ember in his mind. As he drove into Harbor Cove, the quaint, peaceful town felt like an alien planet. How could she live here? How could she trade the power and prestige of his world for this nothingness? He found the cottage at dusk. It was small, secluded, with warm light spilling from its windows. He parked the car down the road and walked, his heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. Through a window he could see a silhouette. a woman in a rocking chair holding a small bundle, Olivia, and their son. He didn't storm the door. He simply stood in the shadows of the pine trees, watching. He saw her stand up and walk with the baby, her movements slow and tender. He saw her press a kiss to the baby's forehead. It was a scene of such profound, quiet intimacy that it felt like a physical blow. He was a spectator to his own life, an intruder looking in on a world to which he had no claim. The fury he had nursed for weeks evaporated, replaced by a vast, hollow ache. This was what she had been protecting her son from. Him, his world, his poison. He finally moved, his feet feeling like lead. He walked up the porch steps, which creaked under his weight. The rocking chair stopped. The silhouette turned. The door opened. She stood there, holding their sleeping son in her arms. She looked different, healthier, stronger. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a calm, wary resolve. "Richard," she said. It wasn't a question. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at the tiny, perfect child in her arms. His son. He had his hair. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Isabella," he managed to say, the name tasting like poison. Olivia nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding, and perhaps pity in her eyes. Of course, the mistress had cashed in her chips. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Did you come to drag us back? To put us in your cage?" The word cage struck him. That's what their penthouse had been. A gilded cage. I don't know," he said, the admission tearing from his throat. It was the truest thing he had said in years. "This is Noah," she said softly, shifting the baby slightly so he could see his face. "Your son." Richard took a hesitant step forward, his hand outstretched, then letting it fall. He had no right to touch him. He was a stranger, a threat. Everything she had written in her letter, every damning word, was true. He saw it now with a terrible, soul-crushing clarity. He had been so obsessed with owning them that he had never learned how to love them. "He's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking. A tear, hot and sharp, traced a path down his cheek. It was the first tear he had shed since he was a boy. They stood there in the doorway for a long time, caught in a silent, fragile truce. The king had come to reclaim his queen and his prince, only to find they had no need for his kingdom. He had come with all his power, but he had never felt so weak. "What happens now, Richard?" Olivia finally asked, her voice gentle but firm. He looked at her. Truly looked at her. For the first time in a decade. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had systematically tried to destroy. And he saw the mother of his child, a fierce protector who had saved her son from his father. The reckoning was not a battle. It was a surrender. "You win, Olivia," he said, the words a quiet admission of his complete and utter defeat. "You were right, about everything." He took a step back, away from the warm light of the cottage, back into the encroaching darkness. "I won't fight you. I'll give you the divorce, whatever you want. The company shares, the foundation. It's all yours. Just let him have a good life. Let him be happy." It was the beginning of a different kind of negotiation, one not based on power or leverage, but on the faint, flickering hope of redemption. He didn't know if he could ever be a father to Noah, but he knew he could no longer be a monster. The journey back would be long and arduous. He would have to dismantle the empire of his own ego, brick by painful brick. But as he turned and walked away from the cottage, leaving his son in the safety of his mother's arms, Richard Sterling took the first faltering step. He had lost everything he thought he wanted, only to find a devastating, humbling, and perhaps, ultimately, life-saving truth. From the cold heights of a Chicago penthouse to the rugged, peaceful shores of Maine. This was a journey of profound transformation, Olivia's brave escape was not just about survival. It was about reclaiming her soul and protecting the future of her unborn child. Richard, a man who had it all, was forced into a brutal reckoning with himself, discovering that his empire of wealth was no substitute for a kingdom of love and family. Their story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about control, but about the courage to let go. What did you think of Olivia's incredible decision? Let us know in the comments below. For more emotional, real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.